The afternoon sun streamed through the large windows of Atlanta International Airport's Terminal B, casting long shadows across the polished floors. A young black woman in her early 30s walked confidently through the terminal, pulling her sleek carry-on suitcase. Her navy blue blazer was perfectly pressed, and her natural hair was styled in an elegant updo, reflecting her position as a high-powered attorney at one of the city's top law firms. She'd made this journey countless times before. The weekly Atlanta to Los Angeles route was practically her second home by now. Today's flight was particularly important. She carried a leather briefcase containing crucial documents for tomorrow's merger meeting, representing one of the biggest deals of her career. As she approached the first-class check-in counter, she noticed the subtle shift in the attendant's expression. That fleeting look of surprise she'd grown all too familiar with over the years. The attendant's smile remained professional, but didn't quite reach her eyes as she checked the boarding pass. "Window seat, 2A," the attendant said, her tone carrying a hint of doubt that made the attorney's stomach clench slightly. Even after 12 years of practicing law and countless achievements, these small moments still stung, though she'd mastered the art of not showing it. Walking toward the security checkpoint, she could feel eyes following her. A group of businessmen in their typical dark suits whispered among themselves, not quite subtle enough to hide their stares. She kept her head high, her steps measured and confident, the way her grandmother had taught her. "Your dignity is your armor," her grandmother used to say, words that had carried her through many such moments. The security line moved slowly, and she used the time to check her emails. Her inbox was flooded with messages about tomorrow's merger, a deal worth over $500 million that would reshape the technology sector on the West Coast. Her firm had chosen her to lead the negotiations, a fact that still made her smile despite the pressure it carried. As she made her way through security, she noticed how the TSA agent seemed to scrutinize her documents a bit longer than those of other passengers, comparing her face to her ID multiple times. She maintained her pleasant expression, having learned long ago that showing any sign of frustration would only make things worse. Finally reaching her gate, she found it already crowded with the usual mix of business travelers and tourists. She stood near the window, gazing out at the massive plane that would carry them across the country. The late afternoon sun glinted off its wings, and she took a moment to center herself, mentally reviewing the key points for tomorrow's meeting. When first-class boarding was announced, she gathered her belongings and moved toward the gate. A few passengers in line gave her those familiar double takes, their eyes moving from her face to her boarding pass and back again. She'd learned to find humor in these moments. If they only knew she'd logged more flight miles this year than most of them combined. Stepping onto the plane, the flight attendant greeted her warmly, this once smile genuine and welcoming, a small but appreciated gesture. As she made her way down the aisle to her seat near the front of first class, she could feel the quiet murmur of conversation pause briefly. Years of experience told her what would come next. She stored her carry-on in the overhead compartment, placed her briefcase under the seat in front, and settled into her window seat with the practiced ease of a frequent flyer. Pulling out her tablet, she began reviewing case notes, appearing completely absorbed in her work while actually being acutely aware of her surroundings. Other passengers filed past her, some doing subtle double takes, others openly staring. A few smiled politely, while others seemed to check their boarding passes with extra care when passing her row, as if convinced there must be some mistake. She pulled out her phone to send a quick text to her assistant about tomorrow's meeting schedule, trying to ignore the growing tension in her shoulders. Experience had taught her that these moments before everyone was seated were often the calm before the storm. Something in the air told her this flight might be different from her usual trips, though she couldn't have known just how different it would turn out to be. The seat next to her remained empty as the first-class cabin filled up, and she found herself hoping, somewhat ironically, for a peaceful flight. But as the final first-class passengers began boarding, she could hear a loud, authoritative voice approaching from the front of the plane. Her instincts, honed by years of reading people in courtrooms and boardrooms, told her that her hope for a quiet flight was about to be thoroughly tested. The loud voice grew closer, belonging to a tall man in an expensive gray suit who was busy talking on his phone while walking down the aisle. His designer watch caught the cabin lights as he gestured, clearly trying to impress everyone within earshot with his business conversation. Of course, I'll be leading the meeting tomorrow. We can't afford any mistakes on this merger, he announced into his phone, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. I've handled deals twice this size before breakfast. As he reached row 2, he glanced at his boarding pass, then at the seat number, and finally at the young black woman sitting in the window seat. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, then to something darker. Ending his call abruptly, he pressed the flight attendant button. A flight attendant quickly appeared, her professional smile firmly in place. "How can I help you, sir?" "There seems to be some confusion," the man said, his voice dripping with fake politeness. "I believe someone may have wandered into first class by mistake." He emphasized the last words while staring pointedly at the woman beside his assigned seat. The attorney continued reviewing her documents, appearing unfazed, though her grip on her tablet tightened slightly. She'd been through similar situations before, but something about this man's tone suggested this might be worse than usual. "Your seat is correct, sir," the flight attendant responded professionally. "2B, right next to the window seat." The man's face reddened slightly. "I understand that," he said, his voice rising. "I'm questioning whether everyone in this row is where they should be. I paid a premium for first class, and I expect a certain standard." Several nearby passengers turned to watch the scene unfold. Some looked uncomfortable, others pretended not to notice, and a few nodded in agreement with the man's implications. The flight attendant glanced at the attorney, who gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Sir, all passengers in first class are properly ticketed. Would you like to take your seat? We're preparing for departure." Muttering under his breath, the man roughly stored his designer briefcase in the overhead compartment. As he sat down, he made a show of adjusting his seat as far away from his seatmate as possible, while pulling out his platinum credit card and premium membership cards, laying them conspicuously on his tray table. "I suppose they're letting anyone buy first-class tickets these days," he said loudly, clearly meant for everyone around to hear. "Back in my day, there were standards." The attorney maintained her composure, calmly highlighting key points in her merger documents. Years of facing down tough opponents in courtrooms had taught her that silence could be more powerful than words. The man wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone again, obviously pretending to text while speaking just loud enough to be heard. "You wouldn't believe who they sat me next to. This airline's really gone downhill. Might have to switch carriers." A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. An elderly woman across the aisle shot him a disapproving look, while a young businessman, 2 rows ahead, turned around to observe the situation more closely. The attorney smoothly pulled out her own phone, quietly beginning to record audio, a habit she developed from years of dealing with difficult situations. She'd learned that documentation was often the best defense against prejudice. Just then, someone in the row directly behind them cleared their throat, a small sound that somehow carried authority. The man in the gray suit didn't notice, too busy making another loud phone call about his important business dealings. The flight attendant returned with pre-flight drinks. When she handed the attorney her requested water, her smile carried a hint of sympathy and solidarity. As she served the man his requested scotch, her movements were notably less warm. The cabin lights dimmed as the final boarding procedures began. The attorney glanced at her watch. Another 3 hours and 45 minutes to Los Angeles. As the captain's voice came over the intercom announcing their departure, she could sense this flight was about to become memorable for reasons nobody in first class could yet imagine. Little did the man know, his performance was being carefully observed by someone whose opinion would soon matter very much to his future. The pieces were already in place for a lesson in humility that would change more than just one flight. It would change lives. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the man in the gray suit seemed to grow bolder with each passing minute. He pulled out his laptop, making sure everyone could see its expensive brand logo, and began typing aggressively, his elbow purposefully invading his seatmate's space. "You know," he announced to no one in particular, though his voice carried across several rows, "I've been flying first class for 20 years now." Back then, it meant something. The right people understood the value of luxury travel. The attorney continued working on her tablet, her face a mask of professional indifference. She'd learned long ago that people like him often became more agitated when their attempts at provocation failed. A flight attendant passed by with magazines. The man grabbed several business journals, flipping through them dramatically before pausing at an article. "Oh, look at this," he said loudly. "An article about maintaining excellence in business. Some people just don't understand what that means anymore." He turned slightly toward his seatmate. "I suppose your company must have some sort of special program that paid for your ticket." The question dripped with condescension. The attorney took a slow sip of her water, her eyes never leaving her document. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes silence speaks volumes. The man's face reddened at her continued composure. Behind them, someone shifted in their seat. A rustling of papers suggested the passenger was taking notes, though neither the attorney nor the man paid much attention to this detail. The man's next tactic was to make a show of calling the flight attendant again. "Excuse me," he said loudly, "I'm wondering about upgrading to a more suitable seat, somewhere more comfortable." His emphasis on suitable made his meaning clear to everyone within earshot. The flight attendant's professional smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened. "I'm sorry, sir, but first class is fully booked today. Perhaps I could offer you some complimentary noise-canceling headphones." He waved her away with obvious disgust. Turning back to his laptop, he began a loud phone call using his expensive wireless earbuds, despite the flight attendant's earlier reminder about phone regulations. "You wouldn't believe the situation here," he practically shouted into his phone. "I'm trying to review our merger documents, but the standards have really slipped. Remember when first class meant first class?" The attorney calmly pulled up another document on her tablet, one that made her lips curve into a slight smile. It was the morning's updated merger brief, containing information this man clearly didn't have. The man glanced at her screen and scoffed. "I hope you're not playing at being a business person with those documents. Some roles require natural qualification, if you know what I mean." A few passengers were now openly staring, their expressions ranging from embarrassment to disgust at his behavior. A young woman across the aisle had begun recording discreetly on her phone. The attorney's phone buzzed with an email. As she checked it, her smile grew slightly wider. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. She knew exactly what was coming, but she maintained her peaceful silence, allowing events to unfold naturally. The man, interpreting her smile as a challenge, decided to escalate further. "Let me guess," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're heading to LA for a big important business meeting." He laughed at his own joke, clearly expecting others to join in. Nobody did. The silence in the cabin was deafening. "I actually have a very important merger meeting tomorrow myself," he continued, unable to read the room. "The kind of meeting that determines the future of real companies. Not that you'd understand anything about that." The attorney quietly slipped her corporate credit card back into her wallet after paying for in-flight Wi-Fi. The same platinum card the man had been flashing earlier. The movement caught his eye, and his expression flickered with uncertainty for the first time. Behind them, the sound of a throat clearing became more pronounced. The man still didn't turn around, too invested in his performance to notice the growing tension in the cabin. The attorney, however, checked her watch again. The time for silence was almost over. The next few minutes would teach this man a lesson he'd never forget. one that would cost him far more than just his dignity. The pieces were set, and the businessman's world was about to turn upside down in the most unexpected way. The attorney pulled out a sleek leather portfolio from her briefcase, the kind used for major corporate presentations. The man in the gray suit glanced over, trying to appear uninterested, while clearly straining to read what was written on the documents inside. Her phone buzzed again. Another email about tomorrow's merger. She opened it calmly, the movement allowing the man to catch a glimpse of her company email signature. For a brief moment, his eyes widened as he noticed the prestigious law firm's name, but he quickly covered his reaction with another scoff. "Probably just an intern," he muttered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. These big firms have all sorts of diversity programs these days. Lowering the bar, if you ask me. The attorney continued reviewing her documents, her fingers moving swiftly across her tablet as she added notes to the merger agreement. Each page she flipped revealed more complex financial statements and legal documents, making the man increasingly uneasy, though he tried hard not to show it. A flight attendant passed by, offering drinks. "Would you like your usual ginger tea?" she asked the attorney with genuine warmth, revealing that she was indeed a regular on this route. This small detail seemed to irritate the man even more. "I'll have another scotch," he snapped at the flight attendant. "Top shelf this time. Some of us here actually paid for first class." He emphasized the word paid while glaring sideways at his seatmate. The attorney's phone lit up with a video call request from her firm's senior partners. She declined it smoothly, sending a quick text explaining she was in flight. The man caught sight of the exchange and shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Behind them, the sound of papers being shuffled became more pronounced. A deep voice made a few quiet phone calls, though the words were indistinct. The man in the gray suit remained oblivious, too caught up in his own performance to notice. 20 years in business, he announced to the cabin at large, and I've never seen standards drop so low. When I started, people knew their place. I mean, their proper place in the business world. The attorney calmly placed her phone on her tray table, the voice memo app still quietly recording. Years of legal experience had taught her the value of documentation. Several passengers who had been watching the scene unfold nodded approvingly at her professional handling of the situation. She opened another document on her tablet, the merger company's current board structure and executive team photos. The man's face was there, though in a much less prominent position than his earlier boasting would suggest. His eyes darted to the screen, and for a moment, confusion crossed his face. "You know," he said, trying to regain his composure, "I'm pretty important at my company. Very important, actually. I can have someone like you fired with a single phone call." His threat hung in the air, hollow and desperate. The attorney finally allowed herself a small smile, though she continued her work without engaging. She pulled up another email, this one containing tomorrow's meeting agenda. The man's name was notably absent from the list of key decision-makers. The flight attendant returned with the man's scotch. As she placed it on his tray, she gave the attorney a subtle wink. "Can I get you anything else, ma'am? Perhaps some more water for your merger meeting tomorrow." The man's hand froze halfway to his scotch glass. The casual mention of a merger meeting seemed to finally plant a seed of doubt in his mind. He pulled out his phone, frantically scrolling through emails, his earlier bravado beginning to crack. The attorney's tablet now displayed a series of legal documents bearing tomorrow's date and the logos of both companies involved in the merger. The man's complexion began to pale as realization slowly dawned on him. Just then, the voice from behind them cleared its throat again, more deliberately this time. The sound carried an authority that made several passengers turn around. The moment of revelation was approaching, and the man's carefully constructed world of superiority was about to come crashing down. The atmosphere in first class shifted dramatically when a distinguished-looking man in the row behind finally leaned forward. His tailored suit was impeccable, and the quiet authority he carried made several passengers straighten in their seats instinctively. He'd have been watching and listening to everything unfold, taking detailed notes on his leather-bound notepad. As the CEO of one of the largest technology companies in the country, he had made his career by paying attention to details that others missed. The man's hand rested on his opened laptop, which displayed emails about tomorrow's merger, the very same merger that the loud passenger had been bragging about. But unlike the boastful man in the gray suit, this CEO actually held the power to make or break the deal. "Interesting comments you've been making," the CEO said, his voice calm, but carrying enough weight to make nearby passengers turn around. "I've been particularly fascinated by your views on standards." The man in the gray suit didn't turn around immediately, still too absorbed in his own self-importance to register the significance of the voice behind him. He simply grunted and reached for his scotch, taking another sip. "You seem very confident about your role in tomorrow's merger," the CEO continued, his tone measured. "Though I must admit, I'm having trouble reconciling your comments with what I know about the meeting attendees." Now the man in the gray suit did turn, annoyance flickering across his face, until he saw who was speaking to him. The color drained from his face so quickly that several passengers thought he might faint. The CEO glanced at his notebook, where he'd been documenting every discriminatory comment made during the flight. "You mentioned something about people knowing their place," he asked, raising an eyebrow. "And about having the power to fire people with a single phone call." The man in the gray suit opened and closed his mouth several times, but no words came out. His earlier bravado had evaporated completely, replaced by a look of dawning horror. Other passengers were now watching openly, sensing that something significant was unfolding. The young woman who had been recording earlier smiled slightly and adjusted her phone for a better angle. "I've been sitting here," the CEO continued, "listening to you demean one of the most respected corporate attorneys in the country, the very attorney, in fact, who holds significant influence over whether tomorrow's merger moves forward." The attorney remained focused on her work, though a slight smile played at the corners of her mouth. She'd known exactly who was sitting behind them. He had been her mentor for years and had championed her career from the beginning. "What's particularly interesting," the CEO went on, his voice carrying just enough edge to make the man flinch, "is that you seem to believe you're a key player in tomorrow's negotiations. Yet, as chairman of the board, I don't recall seeing your name on any of the critical documents." A flight attendant passed by, hiding a smile as she witnessed the scene. Several passengers exchanged knowing looks, quietly enjoying the way justice was being served at 35,000 feet. The CEO pulled out his phone, making a show of scrolling through his emails. "In fact, according to this morning's updated agenda, your role in merger is purely advisory. Though given what I've witnessed today, I suspect we'll need to revisit even that limited involvement." The man's face had now taken on a grayish tint. His hands trembled as he reached for his scotch, nearly knocking it over. The reality of his situation was crashing down around him with the force of a tidal wave. Behind them, the CEO closed his notebook with a decisive snap. "I believe," he said, his voice carrying throughout the quiet cabin, "that we need to have a serious discussion of company culture and values. Perhaps we should start that conversation right now." The man in the gray suit seemed to shrink in his seat, his expensive suit no longer projecting the power he tried so hard to flaunt. He was about to learn that real authority didn't need to be announced. It was demonstrated through actions, respect, and character. The attorney finally turned away from her tablet, facing the man in the gray suit directly for the first time. Her voice was calm and professional, carrying years of courtroom confidence. "I believe we hadn't been properly introduced," she said, her words clear and measured. "I'm the lead attorney handling the merger between your company and West Coast Technologies. I'll be overseeing all legal aspects of tomorrow's negotiations." The man's face, already pale, turned almost white. His hands gripped the armrests so tightly his knuckles showed white. Other passengers leaned forward slightly, not wanting to miss a word of what was unfolding. "In fact," she continued, pulling up a document on her tablet. "I have the latest contract draft right here. Your company's board approved my firm's appointment 3 months ago." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. "Though I'm curious why you weren't aware of this, given your claimed importance to the deal." A flight attendant passing by slowed her pace, trying to hide a smile as she witnessed the man's carefully constructed facade crumbling. Several passengers exchanged knowing looks, while others continued recording discreetly on their phones. "The merger documents," the attorney went on, her voice carrying just enough edge to make the man wince, "require all parties to adhere to strict non-discrimination policies." These policies were actually a key condition for West Coast Technologies agreeing to the deal. The CEO behind them cleared his throat again. "A condition I personally insisted on," he added, his deep voice carrying authority that made the man sink even lower in his seat. "We take corporate culture very seriously at West Coast Technologies." The attorney nodded, pulling up another document. "Section 8.4 of the merger agreement specifically addresses workplace conduct and cultural integration." She turned her tablet slightly, allowing the man to see his own company's signature on the document. "Your board chairman signed this just last week." By now, the man's earlier arrogance had completely vanished. He loosened his tie nervously, looking around as if searching for an escape route. But at 35,000 feet, there was nowhere to hide from the consequences of his actions. I didn't realize," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I assumed." "Yes," the attorney said calmly, "you did a lot of assuming today. You assumed quite a bit about my credentials, my right to be in this seat, and my role in tomorrow's meeting." She kept her voice level, yet each word carried the weight of years of dealing with similar prejudices. The CEO leaned forward again. "I've been taking detailed notes about your behavior during this flight," he said, holding up his notebook. "Every comment, every implication, every attempt at humiliation. The board will be very interested in reviewing this, especially given our company's zero-tolerance policy for discrimination." A young business traveler across the aisle, who had been watching the scene unfold, couldn't hide his satisfied smile. An elderly woman nearby nodded approvingly, while others pretended to read their magazines while listening intently. "The irony," the attorney added, turning back to her tablet, "is that I was actually planning to recommend some leadership roles for your division after the merger. We need experienced people to handle the transition." She paused meaningfully. "Well, we did need them." The man's eyes widened as the full implications of his behavior began to dawn on him. Not only had he publicly harassed the lead attorney for the merger, but he'd done it in front of the CEO of the acquiring company. His hands shook as he reached for his water glass, knocking over his scotch in the process. The amber liquid spread across his tray table, soaking into his expensive suit sleeve. A fitting metaphor for how his career was currently unraveling. The CEO was already typing an email on his phone, his expression serious. The attorney had returned to reviewing her documents, though now there was a subtle shift in what she was reading. Sections about termination clauses and conduct violations. The other passengers in first class had witnessed a powerful lesson about prejudice, professionalism, and consequences. The man's world had shifted dramatically in the space of a few minutes, and the next part of this flight would only bring more revelations. The atmosphere in first class had transformed completely. The same passengers who had witnessed the man's earlier arrogance now watched as events unfolded like a perfectly orchestrated play. "Let me be perfectly clear," the CEO said, still typing on his phone. "Our company has spent 5 years building a culture of respect and inclusion. We've turned down profitable deals because of cultural misalignment." He looked up from his phone, his gaze intense. "I won't let anyone jeopardize that." The attorney pulled up another document on her tablet. "Perhaps you'd be interested in seeing the diversity initiatives your own company agreed to as part of the merger," she said, her voice professional but carrying a hint of irony. "The very programs you mocked earlier." The man's hands were shaking so badly now that he had to clasp them together in his lap. The expensive watch he'd flaunted earlier caught the cabin light, seeming to mock his current situation. There must be some misunderstanding, he stuttered, his voice barely audible. I was just making conversation. I didn't mean to. To what? The CEO interrupted, his voice sharp. To suggest that certain people don't belong in first class. To imply that professional accomplishments are somehow tied to race. He gestured to his notebook. I have every word you said written down here. A flight attendant approached with fresh napkins to clean up the spilled scotch. As she worked, she couldn't help but notice the man's merger documents displayed on his laptop. Documents that were clearly outdated, showing just how out of the loop he really was. You know, the attorney said thoughtfully, I've handled dozens of corporate mergers, and there's one thing I've learned. She paused, letting her words hang in the air. The success of any merger depends more on people than profits. Cultural alignment is everything. The CEO nodded in agreement, which is exactly why I'm sending these emails right now. He held up his phone. The first is to our board, the second to your company's chairman, and the third to HR. I think they'll find my observations about your leadership style quite enlightening. The man loosened his tie further, looking desperately around the cabin. Other passengers quickly averted their eyes, though one young professional couldn't hide a satisfied smirk. Please, the man whispered, I have a family to support. A mortgage. I can't lose this job. The attorney raised an eyebrow. Interesting. Earlier you were bragging about how easily you could have someone fired with a single phone call. Now you understand how it feels to have your livelihood threatened because of someone else's prejudice. The CEO leaned forward again. 20 minutes ago, you were proudly announcing your 20 years of business experience. Let me share what I've learned in 30 years. Real leadership is about lifting people up, not pushing them down. A gentle ding sounded as the seatbelt sign turned off. The timing seemed almost symbolic. Everyone was now free to move about the cabin, while the man remained frozen in his seat, trapped by the consequences of his own actions. The merger documents, the attorney continued, pulling up another file, include a detailed section on workplace conduct and consequences for violations. Your company's legal team approved these terms last week. She turned to face him directly. Would you like to review them? The man's phone buzzed, an email notification. His face fell even further as he read it, likely one of the CEO's messages being forwarded from his superiors. The reality of his situation was hitting him in waves. I never thought, he began, then stopped, realizing how damaging anything he said now could be. That's exactly the problem, the CEO said firmly. You never thought about the impact of your words and actions, but now you'll have plenty of time to think about them, starting with tomorrow's meeting, which you won't be attending. The attorney calmly returned to her work, though now she was clearly reviewing different sections of the merger documents, ones dealing with personnel changes and restructuring. The message was clear. The tables hadn't just turned. They'd been completely flipped over. The CEO's phone began buzzing with responses to his emails. Each notification made the man in the gray suit flinch, knowing his career was unraveling with every passing minute. Your board chairman just responded, the CEO announced, his tone matter of fact. He's requesting an immediate video call upon landing. Apparently, they're quite concerned about the liability your behavior could bring to the company, especially during such a sensitive merger. The attorney pulled up yet another document on her tablet. Speaking of liability, she said calmly, several passengers have been recording your behavior. In today's social media age, corporate misconduct tends to travel fast. She gestured subtly to the young woman across the aisle, who was still discreetly filming. The man's face, already pale, somehow managed to lose even more color. He reached for his phone with trembling hands, probably seeing messages from his own company starting to pour in. I've scheduled an emergency meeting with both legal teams for 7 a.m. tomorrow. The attorney continued, her voice professionally neutral. We'll need to discuss whether your conduct violates the terms of our preliminary agreement. A flight attendant passed through, offering fresh drinks. This time, the man declined his usual scotch, instead asking for water in a shaky voice. His earlier swagger had been replaced by the demeanor of someone watching their world collapse. You know what's ironic? The CEO mused, still reviewing incoming messages on his phone. If you had simply treated everyone with basic respect, you might have learned something valuable about tomorrow's merger. The attorney you've been harassing is actually the architect of the entire deal. Several nearby passengers nodded in appreciation. An older businessman, 2 rows ahead, turned around to give the attorney a respectful nod, clearly impressed by the professional way she'd handled the situation. The man's phone buzzed again, this time with a message that made him audibly gasp. They've suspended my access to the company's servers, he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. And my email. It's already been restricted. Standard protocol, the attorney explained, without looking up from her work. When someone demonstrates poor judgment that could put a major deal at risk, companies tend to act quickly to minimize damage. The CEO leaned forward once more. Your board is particularly concerned about the fact that you claim to be a key decision-maker in tomorrow's merger when you're actually just part of the transition team, a position that's now under review. A gentle chime sounded through the cabin as the pilot announced they were halfway through the flight. For the man in the gray suit, it might as well have been a countdown to the end of his career. Please, he tried again, his voice barely above a whisper. There must be something I can do to fix this. Some way to make it right. The attorney finally looked up from her tablet. You know, I've faced people like you throughout my entire career. People who judge others based on appearance rather than ability. Usually, they're smart enough not to show their true colors in front of the CEO of a major corporation. 2 younger executives seated nearby exchanged knowing looks. They'd probably witnessed similar situations in their own careers, though perhaps never with such dramatic consequences. Your company's HR department has already requested a full report of the incident, the CEO added, showing another email on his phone. They're particularly interested in whether this behavior reflects a pattern that might have affected your team's diversity numbers. The man closed his eyes, probably calculating the full impact this would have on his life. His mortgage, his children's private school tuition, his country club membership, all the things he'd bragged about earlier now seemed to mock him. Here's something to think about during the rest of our flight, the attorney said, turning back to her merger documents. Success in business isn't about which seat you sit in on a plane. It's about how you treat the people sitting next to you. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, the full weight of what had transpired hung heavily in the first-class cabin. The man in the gray suit sat silently, his earlier arrogance replaced by the hollow look of someone watching their career crumble in real time. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing with notifications. Emails from HR, messages from his superiors, and even a few texts from colleagues who'd already heard about the incident through the company grapevine. News traveled fast in corporate circles, especially when it involved a $500 million merger. Your board just sent over their official statement, the CEO announced, reviewing his latest email. They're launching a full investigation into your department's hiring and promotion practices over the past 5 years. Interesting timing, given tomorrow's merger discussions. The attorney has shifted her focus to different documents now. One's outlining corporate restructuring and employee transition protocols. The message wasn't subtle. These would be very relevant to the man's situation. The video clips from this flight have already reached your company's senior management, she noted calmly. Several passengers were kind enough to share their recordings. In today's world, accountability can be just a phone camera away. Through the plane's windows, the Los Angeles skyline came into view. For most passengers, it signaled the end of a routine flight. For the man in the gray suit, it marked the beginning of a very different life. A car will be waiting at the terminal, the CEO said, his tone businesslike. Not for you, for your company's deputy director. She'll be taking your place in tomorrow's meetings." He paused meaningfully. "She's been doing most of the actual work on this merger anyway, hasn't she?" The man's hands trembled as he tried to straighten his wrinkled suit jacket, the same expensive suit he'd worn so proudly just hours ago. The Scotch stain on his sleeves seemed to symbolize how quickly things could spill out of control. "Your company's legal team is already reviewing the non-discrimination clauses in your employment contract," the attorney added, showing another email on her tablet. "They seem particularly interested in the termination provisions." As the plane touched down, several passengers who had witnessed the entire scene began gathering their belongings, many shooting disapproving looks at the man while nodding respectfully to the attorney and CEO. "An HR representative will meet you at baggage claim," the CEO informed him. "They'll need your company phone, laptop, and security badge. Standard procedure when there's concern about reputational risk." The man's face crumpled as the final pieces of his professional life slipped away. The landing gear touched down with a thud that seemed to emphasize the finality of his situation. "One piece of advice," the attorney said, gathering her own belongings. "When you're explaining this to your family tonight, remember how quickly judgment and prejudice can change someone's life. It's a lesson worth sharing." As passengers began standing to deplane, the young woman who had been recording reached for her overhead bag. "My social media followers are going to love this story," she said quietly to her seatmate. "It's not every day you see karma work so perfectly at 35,000 feet. The CEO stood, straightening his tie. "Your board chairman asked me to tell you not to report to the office tomorrow. Or any other day, for that matter. They'll ship your personal belongings home." The attorney rose gracefully, collecting her briefcase. "You know," she said, looking at the man one final time, "I've won many cases in court, but sometimes the most powerful verdicts are delivered by our own actions." As they walked off the plane, other passengers nodded in solidarity with the attorney. A flight attendant gave her a warm smile and a knowing wink. The man remained seated, staring at his now useless company phone, a living testament to how quickly privilege and prejudice could collide with justice. In the terminal, reporters were already gathering, tipped off about the mid-air confrontation. The story would soon go viral. A powerful reminder that in today's world, accountability could find you anywhere, even in first class at 35,000 feet.